The stone does not remember names, but it remembers the weight of feet. In the White Tower, where the walls are 15 feet thick and the mortar is said to have been tempered with the blood of beasts, time does not flow, it drips. It drips like the condensation from the arched ceilings, slow and rhythmic, marking the dissolution of a dynasty. The year is 1483. Outside, London is a fever of bells and mud, a city gasping under the summer heat and the weight of a crown that has changed heads too many times. But inside the tower, the air is cold. It smells of old rushes, tallow smoke, and the metallic tang of the Thames, which licks at the foundations like a patient serpent. Edward, the fifth of his name, stands by the narrow embrasure. He is 12, an age where a boy should be chasing hawks or learning the geometry of a lance. Instead, he learns the geometry of silence. His hair is the color of pale honey, a legacy of the Plantagenets, but his eyes are the tired eyes of an old man. He watches the ships on the river, fleeting splinters of wood, and wonders if the water knows it is free. Beside him, Richard, the Duke of York, plays with a wooden top. He is 9. His movements are jagged, frantic, as if he is trying to outrun the stillness. The top hums, a low, mournful vibration that fills the small chamber. What is a king without a kingdom? Edward thinks, his fingers tracing the cold limestone. He is a ghost who still breathes. History is often written by the victors, but it is felt by the forgotten. To a historian sitting by a guttering candle centuries later, these boys are mere variables in a political equation, the inconvenience of legitimacy. But to the boys, the great matter is simply the absence of their mother's scent, the missing warmth of the sun, and the way the guards no longer look them in the eye. In the medieval mind, the world was a great chain of being. To break a link was to invite chaos. But here, in the heart of the fortress, the chain has been replaced by a shroud. Their uncle, Gloucester, now King Richard III, is a shadow that lengthens over them even when he is miles away. He is the protector who protected them from their own lives. The philosophy of the threshold. Power is a strange alchemy. It turns blood into ink and brothers into rivals. As we look back through the fog of 500 years, we must ask, what is freedom? Is it the ability to walk beyond the gate, or is it the inner peace of a soul that has accepted its end? For the princes, freedom was a receding shore. The tower was not always a prison, it was a palace. But the line between a throne and a tomb is thinner than the edge of a page. They eat their meals, capons, white bread, wine watered down, on silver plates. The luxury is a mockery. It is the kindness of a butcher who sharpens his knife with a gentle hand. Will we go to the Abbey today, Ned? Richard asks. His voice is thin, like parchment. Edward does not turn. He cannot tell his brother that the Abbey is now a dream. He cannot explain that they are no longer people, but symbols. And symbols do not walk in the sun. Soon, Dickon. When the king is ready, Edward replies. The word king tastes like ash in his mouth. The sensory prison. The boys lived in a world of limited textures. The roughness of wool, the smoothness of silk, the biting cold of the floor. There was the sound of the changing guard, the clatter of polearms, the muffled coughs, the distant barking of a dog in the city. These sounds were their only connection to the living world. At night, the shadows in the room would grow long and distorted. To a child, a shadow is a monster. To a prince, a shadow is a kinsman. They would lie together in the great bed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn, listening to the heartbeat of the building. The tower breathes. It moans as the tide shifts. It whispers the names of the queens who bled on the green and the knights who rotted in the salt pits. Edward prayed. He prayed not for a crown, for he knew its weight would crush his small skull, but for time. Time is the only true currency of the condemned. We imagine that the young do not understand death, but they understand the absence of the future. They feel the narrowing of the path. Faith, in the 15th century, was not a choice, it was the sky. But when the sky is obscured by stone, faith becomes a desperate reach into the dark. If God resides in the light, what resides in the tower? The scent of change. As the weeks passed, the visits from the outside world ceased. The physician, Dr. Argentine, was the last to see them with a sympathetic eye. He noted that Edward was given to sighs and prayers, a boy preparing himself for a transition he could not name. Argentine smelled of lavender and vinegar, the scents of healing. When he left, the scent of the tower returned, damp earth and the lingering smell of the boy's own fear. Fear has a scent, it is sharp, like ozone before a storm. The guards were replaced. Familiar faces vanished, replaced by men with eyes like flint. Men who did not smile when the younger prince performed a feat of tumbling. These men were the architecture of the end. They were the walls given flesh. Reflection on the silence. Why do we obsess over these two children? Is it because they represent the ultimate vulnerability? Or is it because their story is a mirror to our own fears of being erased? We all live in towers of our own making, towers of duty, of isolation, of the things we cannot change. The princes in the tower are the patron saints of the what if. What if the door had opened? What if the uncle had been a different man? What if the stone had spoken? But the stone remained silent. As the sun sets on this first chapter of their disappearance, we see them silhouetted against the window. The light is a deep, bruised purple. It catches the gold in their hair one last time. They are holding hands now. The younger boy has stopped playing with his top. The silence is no longer a backdrop, it is the main actor. The historians will say they vanished. The poets will say they were absorbed by the darkness. But for now, they are still here. They are breathing. They are cold. And the candle is burning down. The transition from a living prince to a forgotten ghost is not marked by a single event, but by the gradual erosion of the familiar. In the second month of their residence within the White Tower, the air began to thicken with the weight of things unsaid. Outside, the summer of 1483 was turning towards a golden autumn, but for the boys, the seasons were no longer measured by the angle of the sun, but by the lengthening shadows of the men who stood at their door. The guards were the first to change. In the beginning, there were the loyal men-at-arms who had served their father, King Edward IV. They were men who spoke of hunting trips and the taste of roasted venison, men who bowed with a certain warmth in their joints. But one by one, these faces vanished. They were replaced by the Black Guard, men whose names were never spoken, whose eyes held the cold reflection of the river's grey depths. These new gaolers did not bow. They did not speak of the world beyond the portcullis. They existed only as rhythmic iron steps in the corridor, a heartbeat of metal on stone. The psyche of the watchman. What does it do to a man to stand watch over a dying light? We must consider the soul of the guard, for he is the mirror in which the prisoner sees his own fate. These men were chosen for their silence, but even silence has a texture. Some looked upon the boys with a hidden, agonizing pity, a flicker of the eye that said, "I am sorry for the world that made me your wall." Others saw only obstacles, living relics of a dead king that stood between them and the favor of the new one. In the medieval mind, service was a sacred bond, yet fear was the stronger master. To protect the princes was to court the wrath of the boar, their uncle, Richard of Gloucester. And so, the guards became statues. They learned to look through the children, treating them as if they were already part of the architecture, as if they were merely carvings in the stone that breathed. This was the first true death, the death of recognition. The tides of the unseen city. Beyond the thick limestone, London was a hive of whispers. The sun in splendor, the emblem of the House of York, seemed to be setting in a sea of blood and ink. Rumors moved through the taverns of Cheapside like a pestilence. Men spoke of the titulus regis, the document that declared the boys illegitimate, transforming them from heirs to bastards of a sinful union. This was the weapon of the law, more lethal than any sword. It erased their identity before it took their lives. In the great hall of Westminster, men who had once knelt to young Edward now argued over the technicalities of his mother's marriage. Time, for the politicians, was a tool of reconfiguration. For the boys, time was a tightening noose. The city, though so close that the smell of its coal fires drifted into their room, was effectively an ocean away. They were in a state of civil death. To the law, they had ceased to be. To the church, they were a problem to be prayed over and then tucked away. The isolation was not just physical, it was an ontological void. The sensory decay, the taste of iron. Edward, the boy king who never wore his crown, began to find that even his dreams were turning to stone. He could no longer remember the smell of the forest at Ludlow. Instead, his world was defined by the smell of the tower, the damp rot of the river, the acrid bite of the torches, and the faint, sweet smell of decay that seemed to seep from the very floorboards. He spent hours watching the dust motes dance in the single beam of light that penetrated their chamber. "Are they free, Ned?" his brother Richard would ask, pointing at the swirling specks. "They go where the air takes them," Edward would reply, his voice losing its youthful resonance. They played games, but the games had lost their joy. They played at knights, but their wooden swords felt heavy and useless. They played at kings, but the crown they imagined was made of thorns and shadows. One afternoon, the younger Richard dropped his wooden top. It rolled toward the door and stopped at the feet of a guard. The boy waited for the man to pick it up, to offer a smile, a sign of shared humanity. The guard simply kicked the toy back into the room without looking down. The sound of the wood skittering across the floor was the sound of a heart breaking. Philosophical reflection, the sovereignty of the soul. In this state of total pressure, what remains of a human being? When the title is stripped, when the family is scattered, and when the walls close in, where does the self reside? Perhaps freedom is not the absence of walls, but the ability to remain oneself within them. Yet, for a child, the self is still a growing thing, a vine that needs sunlight to climb. Without it, the vine withers and turns inward. The princes were learning a lesson usually reserved for the aged, that the world is a fleeting illusion, and power is a ghost. Faith was their only bridge. They were seen often at prayer, their knees bruised by the cold stone. Were they praying for rescue, or were they praying for the strength to endure the inevitable? The eternal shroud begins to fall. The isolation reached its zenith when the physician, Dr. Argentine, made his final visit. He saw the change, the way Edward's skin had turned the color of parchment, the way his eyes seemed to be looking at something far beyond the tower. The doctor left, and the door was bolted with a finality that echoed through the centuries. The boys were now truly alone. No more letters from their mother. No more visits from the priest. Only the two of them, huddled together in the center of a storm that had turned into a vacuum. The White Tower was no longer a palace or a prison, it was a sarcophagus. As the second part of our chronicle ends, we see the boys sitting in the deepening twilight. The city bells are ringing for vespers, a mournful sound that speaks of mercy and rest. But in the tower, there is no rest. There is only the waiting. The candle is shorter now, its flame flickering in a draught that shouldn't exist, casting two small shadows against the wall, shadows that are already beginning to merge with the dark. By the time the harvest moon began to rise over the jagged skyline of London, the White Tower had ceased to be a place of residence and had become a state of mind. The third month of their confinement brought with it a silence so profound that it felt like a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums of the two young plantagenets. In this part of the chronicle, we observe the steady dissolution of hope and the emergence of a quiet, tragic dignity. The world outside continued its frantic dance. King Richard III was crowned at Westminster, an event of crimson velvet and heavy gold that seemed like a fever dream to the boys. They did not hear the cheers, nor did they see the banners. They only felt the vibration of the great bells, a low, rhythmic thrumming in the floorboards that spoke of a world that had moved on without them. The men of silence and the ritual of the meal. The routine of their lives was now a series of mechanical gestures. Every morning, the heavy iron bolt would scream in its housing, and a man would enter with a tray. He was always masked by the dim light of the corridor, his face a blurred smudge of indifference. The food was still fine, meat in thick gravies, white manchet bread, but it had lost its savor. To the boys, it tasted of iron and salt. Edward, now increasingly frail, began to watch the man's hands. Hands tell stories that faces try to hide. He saw the callus of a soldier, the scars of old brawls, and the way the fingers trembled slightly as they set down the pitcher of small beer. "Do you have children, sir?" Edward asked one morning. His voice was a rasp, unused and dusty. The man paused. For a heartbeat, the silence of the tower was breached by a human memory. The man's shadow flickered against the cold wall. But the order was absolute. He turned and left without a word, the heavy door clanging shut like the lid of a tomb. This was the most cruel of tortures, to be surrounded by living men who acted as if you were already dead. The psychological twilight, Edward's descent. Edward, the boy who should have been king, began to retreat into a landscape of prayer and memory. He spent hours tracing the Latin inscriptions carved into the walls by previous prisoners. He wondered about the men who had scratched their names into the limestone, men who had felt the same damp cold, the same racing of the heart when the sun began to set. He began to talk to the stones. He told them of the meadows at Ludlow, of the way the River Severn looked when the mist was rising, of his mother's laugh before it was choked by grief. He was not losing his mind, he was simply expanding it to fill the void. When the physical world is stripped away, the mind becomes a kingdom of its own, populated by ghosts and echoes. Dickon, Edward whispered to his brother as they sat huddled in the window embrasure, do you think the birds know we are here? They fly so close to the bars. The birds are the king's messengers, the younger Richard replied, clutching a threadbare cushion. They are waiting for us to turn into feathers so we can fly away too. Philosophical reflection, the nature of mercy. In the medieval worldview, mercy was a divine attribute, yet in the hands of men, it was often used as a cloak for execution. Was it more merciful to end a life quickly, or to let it fade away in the dark? To the historian, the disappearance of the princes is a mystery of politics. To the philosopher, it is a meditation on the cruelty of the slow end. We must ask, what is a life worth when it is no longer recognized by the state? The boys were experiencing a unique form of suffering, they were being erased from the present tense. They were becoming legends before they had even stopped breathing. In this vacuum, faith was no longer a comfort, it was a desperate bargain. Edward prayed for his soul, but in the darker corners of his heart, he prayed for an end to the waiting. The waiting was the sharpest blade of all. The scent of the approaching end. The air in the chamber had changed. It no longer smelled just of dampness, it smelled of the exhaustion of hope. It was the scent of cold tallow, of unwashed wool, and of the dry, metallic dust that settles on things that are never moved. One evening, they heard a different sound, not the rhythmic tread of the guard, but a soft, sliding noise. Someone was outside, not to bring food, but to listen. Edward stood by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pressed his ear to the oak. He heard the sound of breathing, heavy, ragged, and filled with a strange, weeping quality. "Who is there?" he whispered. No answer came. Only the sound of feet retreating down the spiral staircase, fast and frantic. It was a moment of terrifying connection, a reminder that there were people who still knew they existed, but who were too afraid to touch the light. The final candle of Part 3. As the candle gutters toward the end of its life, we see the two brothers lying in the great bed. They are smaller now, their faces sharp and pale against the dark velvet. The younger Richard is asleep, his breath shallow and quick. Edward stays awake, watching the last embers in the hearth. He realizes that the tower is not just a building, it is a mouth. It has swallowed his father's reign, his mother's safety, and now it is slowly digesting him. But even in this darkness, there is a terrible beauty. He looks at his brother's hand resting in his own. Two small sparks of life in an ocean of shadow. The bells of the city strike midnight. The sound is muffled by the thick walls, sounding like a heart beating in a distant room. The third part of their story closes not with a bang, but with a sigh. The boys are still here, but the world is growing thinner around them. As the autumn of 1483 deepened, the air within the White Tower became a stagnant pond of cold humidity. The fourth month of their isolation was not merely a passage of time, it was a psychological erosion. The stones themselves seemed to exhale a fine, grey dust that settled upon the boys' skin, turning the vibrant gold of their plantagenet hair into the dull hue of tarnished brass. This chapter of our chronicle examines the final convergence of political necessity and human tragedy, as the shadows outside the tower finally found their way within. The sun was a stranger now. Even in the height of noon, the light that struggled through the narrow, barred apertures was weak and filtered, stripped of its warmth by the immense thickness of the Norman masonry. To the elder boy, Edward, the world beyond the window had become a tapestry of sounds without images, the distant, rhythmic thumping of a blacksmith's hammer, the sharp cries of watermen on the Thames, and the occasional, haunting peal of bells from St. Peter ad Vincula. These sounds were the ghosts of a life he had once led, a life that now felt like a story told to him by someone long dead. The harbinger, the arrival of the night walkers. One evening, the silence of the corridor was broken by a sound that differed from the usual mechanical clatter of the guards. It was the sound of voices, low, urgent, and devoid of the deference usually afforded to those of royal blood. In the medieval mind, the king's peace was a sacred shield, but that shield had been shattered at the gates of the Tower. Edward stood by the heavy oak door, his breath held in his chest. He heard the rattling of keys, a sound that usually signaled the arrival of a meal or the changing of the watch. But this was different. The keys turned with a deliberate, slow precision. 3 men entered the outer chamber. History remembers their names, though the shadows they cast were far larger than their reputations. Miles Forrest, a man described as a professional slaughterer of men, John Dighton, a big, broad-shouldered groom, and William Slaughter, the gaoler whose very name seemed a cruel jest of fate. They did not look like the monsters of a child's nightmare. They looked like tired men performing a difficult task. This is the true horror of history, that the most profound evils are often carried out by men who are simply following a ledger of costs and benefits. They brought with them the smell of the outside, the scent of horse sweat, wet wool, and the sharp, cold air of the London night. To the princes, this smell was both a memory of freedom and a herald of the end. The Dialogue of the Doomed, a meditation on time. Young Richard, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, retreated to the corner of the bed, clutching a small wooden cross his mother had given him. "Ned," he whispered, "the men have no lights in their eyes." Edward did not answer. He was looking at Miles Forrest. He saw not a murderer, but a mirror. He saw the world that his uncle, King Richard III, had built, a world where the shortest distance between 2 points of power was a straight line drawn through a human heart. "Is it time?" Edward asked. His voice was steady, possessed of a clarity that comes only when hope has finally been extinguished. Forrest did not answer. He began to snuff out the candles, one by one. The ritual of darkness had begun. The removal of light is the first act of erasure. When the eyes can no longer see the world, the soul begins to detach from the flesh. Philosophical reflection, the sovereignty of silence. We must ponder the nature of power in these final moments. The crown of England, a circle of gold and jewels, sat miles away on the head of a man who could not sleep. Yet here, in the dark, the 2 boys possessed a sovereignty that no usurper could touch, the sovereignty of the victim. In the eyes of God, the medieval theologian would argue, the one who suffers the blow is more powerful than the one who deals it, for the victim holds the key to the striker's eternal judgment. What is a kingdom? Is it a collection of counties and castles, or is it a shared belief? By removing these 2 boys, the new king hoped to solidify his belief. But he forgot that a ghost is harder to kill than a man. A ghost can be everywhere at once. A ghost can whisper from the stones for 500 years. The isolation was meant to make them disappear, but it only served to make them eternal. The sensory overload of the final night. The room was now illuminated only by the faint, dying glow of the hearth. The shadows danced on the ceiling like long, skeletal fingers. Edward felt the rough texture of the velvet quilt beneath him. He smelled the smoke of the tallow, a thick and cloying scent that seemed to coat the back of his throat. He moved to the bed and lay down beside his brother. He felt Richard's heart beating against his side, a fast, frantic rhythm, like a bird caught in a net. He took his brother's hand. The skin was cold, but the grip was desperate. "Close your eyes, Dickon," Edward whispered. "Think of the gardens at Westminster. Think of the lilies by the river. The water is very blue there, and the sun never goes behind the clouds." He began to recite the Nunc Dimittis, the prayer of Simeon, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word." The words were a shield, a fragile barrier of language against the encroaching void. The architecture of the end. The men moved with a terrifying efficiency. There was no need for blades. Blades are noisy and leave a mess of blood that the stones might whisper about later. In the tower, the preferred method was the feather bed, the very instrument of rest turned into a tool of the final sleep. The weight of the world began to press down. Not just the weight of the men, but the weight of the dynasty, the weight of the War of the Roses, the weight of 1,000 years of kings who had killed to keep what they had. The air was squeezed from the room. Edward felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing, not for the crown, but for a single breath of the wind that blew across the Thames. And then, there was the silence. Not the heavy, expectant silence of the past few months, but a new kind of silence. A hollow silence. The silence of a room that is suddenly empty, even though it is occupied. The aftermath, the burial in the dark. The men did not stay to pray. They carried the small, limp bundles down the winding stair, their boots scuffing against the stone. They sought a place where the earth would not speak. At the foot of the staircase, deep beneath the foundations, they dug a hole in the rubble and the lime. They buried them deep. They thought that by covering them with stone and earth, they were ending the story. They did not realize that they were planting a seed. As we close this fourth part of our journey, the White Tower stands tall and indifferent against the night sky. The torches on the battlements flicker in the wind. The guards walk their rounds. The city of London sleeps, unaware that its heart has been hollowed out. The princes are gone from the light, but they have entered the marrow of the building. The candles in their chamber have all gone out, and the smoke has curled away into the rafters, leaving only the scent of cold stone and the memory of a sigh. The silence that followed the events in the White Tower was not a void, but a presence. In the months and years that followed that fateful autumn of 1483, the disappearance of the two princes, Edward and Richard, ceased to be a mere administrative anomaly and transformed into a spectral weight that hung over the reign of King Richard III. This chapter of our chronicle explores the long, cold aftermath, the psychological decay of a kingdom built on a secret, and the first whispers of the theories that would eventually weave the boys into the very fabric of English folklore. The ghost in the machine of state. In the immediate wake of the boys' removal from public view, the official stance was one of strategic ambiguity. The tower remained a fortress of ironclad secrets. Outside its walls, the air was thick with a new kind of tension, a tension born of the unknown. To the people of London, the princes were neither dead nor alive, they existed in a liminal state, twilight zone, of legitimacy. King Richard III, now firmly on the throne, found that a crown won in the shadows is a heavy thing to wear in the light. Contemporary accounts suggest a man increasingly besieged by his own conscience. The medieval world believed firmly in the divine right of kings, but it also believed in divine retribution. Every setback, every illness in the royal family, and every rumble of rebellion from the south was seen through the prism of the missing boys. We must consider the sensory experience of a king haunted by what he has done. Imagine the halls of Westminster at night, the flickering tapestries, the cold draughts that seem to carry the sound of a child's laughter or a distant, stifled sob. Power, when bought with the blood of kin, turns the world into a hall of mirrors. The smell of the incense in the royal chapel began to smell of the lime and rubble beneath the tower stairs. The taste of the finest wine turned to the metallic tang of the Thames water. Richard was no longer just a ruler, he was a man trying to outrun a shadow that was attached to his own heels. The birth of rumor, the many faces of fate. As the years passed and no bodies were produced, the vacuum of information was filled by the inexhaustible imagination of the populace. This is the moment where history begins to fracture into 1,000 what-ifs. The mystery of the princes was born not from their death, but from the silence surrounding it. The theories began as ripples in a pond. Some whispered that the boys had been smuggled out in the middle of the night, hidden in woolsacks and sent to the courts of Burgundy or the wild hills of Ireland. Others suggested a more sinister survival, that one had been spared while the other perished, a solitary witness to his own erasure. In the taverns of Cheapside, men spoke of a mock king or a hidden prince. These stories were a form of psychological resistance. To believe the boys were alive was to believe that the world still had a chance at justice. It was a refusal to accept the finality of the stone walls. This is a recurring theme in human history. When the truth is too dark to bear, we invent a light that never goes out. Philosophical reflection, the immortality of the unresolved. What is more powerful, a martyr or a mystery? A martyr is a closed book, a story with an ending that inspires. A mystery, however, is an open wound. It demands attention. It refuses to be buried. By failing to provide a public account of the prince's fate, the Yorkist regime ensured their eternal life. Time is the great eraser of men, but it is the great magnifier of legends. The princes became symbols of lost innocence, of a golden age that never was. In the medieval mind, the wheel of fortune was always turning. Today's king is tomorrow's dust. But a mystery sits at the center of the wheel, unchanging and unmoving. The boys in the tower became the fixed point around which the history of the late Middle Ages revolved. The scent of the changing guard. In 1485, the world changed again. The red dragon of the Tudors rose at Bosworth Field. As Richard III lay in the mud, his crown rolling under a hawthorn bush, the mystery of the tower was inherited by a new dynasty. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, found himself in a peculiar position. To solidify his own claim, he needed the princes to be dead, yet to prove they were dead was to invite uncomfortable questions about his own timing. The tower, under the Tudors, became a place of even deeper secrets. The smell of the fortress changed from the damp of the plantagenets to the sharp, clinical smell of a new era of bureaucracy. The investigations were conducted behind closed doors. Men were questioned, confessions were extracted, and yet the truth remained as elusive as the morning mist over the river. Reflection on the isolation of the truth. We must ask, does the truth matter if it is never known? If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If two princes are buried in the dark and no one finds them for centuries, were they ever truly gone? The isolation of the princes was now total. They were isolated from history itself. They were no longer Edward and Richard, they were the princes in the tower, a collective noun, a tragic abstraction. They had been robbed of their lives, their titles, and finally, their individuality. As we reach the conclusion of this fifth part, we see the White Tower standing through the decades. It sees the rise of the Tudors, the Reformation, the fires of London. It holds its breath. Beneath the stairs, the lime and the rubble continue to do their slow, silent work. The boys are waiting. They are waiting for a voice that can speak through the stone, for a hand that can reach through the centuries to find the truth that was buried in the dark. The White Tower did not give up its secret easily. For nearly 200 years, the story of the princes remained a ghost story, a tool for playwrights like Shakespeare and a cautionary tale for those who sought power at any cost. But history has a way of breathing through the cracks in the stone, and the earth has a memory that cannot be forever suppressed. This final chapter of our chronicle traces the journey from the darkness of the 15th century to the clinical light of the modern age, concluding with a meditation on the permanence of the human spirit. The discovery in the rubble, 1674. The year was 1674. The reign of the Tudors was long gone, replaced by the Stuarts, and England was a world of wig-wearing scientists and burgeoning empires. In the White Tower, workers under the command of King Charles II were tasked with demolishing an old wooden staircase that led to the chapel of St. John the Evangelist. As they cleared away the debris and dug into the foundations, they found something that stopped their breath. 10 feet deep, buried within a wooden chest, lay the remains of two small skeletons. The air in the pit was cold and smelled of ancient lime. The workers, men of a different age, felt a sudden, primitive chill. These were not just bones, they were the physical manifestation of a 2-century-old shadow. The skeletons were arranged together, as if in a final, eternal embrace. This was the moment that mystery of the princes touched the physical world. The abstract tragedy had finally found its flesh, or what remained of it. King Charles II, moved by a rare moment of historical reverence, ordered the remains to be placed in a white marble urn and interred in Westminster Abbey, in the Lady Chapel built by Henry VII, the very man who had inherited the throne from their supposed killer. It was a gesture of reconciliation across time, a way of bringing the boys home to the sanctuary they were never allowed to reach in life. The scientific gaze, the search for truth. In 1933, the urn was opened. Surgeons and anatomists examined the fragile bones, hoping that science could answer the questions that history had left blank. They looked for signs of trauma, for the dental evidence of age, for any clue that could pin a date or a cause to their passing. The findings were suggestive but inconclusive. They confirmed the ages, roughly 12 and 10, and noted a darkening of the bone that could have been caused by the pressure of the burial. But science, for all its precision, cannot hear a scream through 5 centuries of silence. It can tell us the how of the body, but never the why of the soul. In recent years, the debate has shifted to DNA and the possibilities of modern genetics. Yet, a part of us resists the final answer. Why? Because the mystery has become more vital than the truth. To solve the riddle is to kill the legend. The boys in the tower have become a part of the English landscape precisely because they are unresolved. They are the unsolved in a world that demands an explanation for everything. Philosophical reflection, the architecture of memory. What does it mean to be remembered? For Edward and Richard, memory was their only afterlife. They were robbed of their adulthood, their marriages, their achievements, and their deaths. All they were left with was their name and the wall that held them. We must consider the nature of time. To the stones of the White Tower, 200 years is but a blink of an eye. To a human being, it is an eternity. The princes remind us that while power is a heavy, noisy thing, it is ultimately fragile. Richard III's dynasty lasted only 2 years after their disappearance. The boys, however, have occupied the human heart for over 500. Freedom, we realize, is not just the ability to move through space, it is the ability to exist in the minds of others. In this sense, the princes are freer than the kings who imprisoned them. They are no longer confined by the tower, they are part of the wind, the river, and the collective conscience of a nation. The final scent, the smell of lilies and stone. If you visit the tower today, the air still feels different near the site of the old staircase. It doesn't smell of blood or fear anymore, it smells of cold, clean stone and the faint, sweet scent of the lilies that people sometimes leave at the memorial. The sounds of the modern city, the roar of traffic, the chatter of tourists, cannot penetrate the deep silence of the inner walls. There is a beauty in this silence. It is the beauty of a story that has finally found its peace, even if it hasn't found its explanation. The princes are no longer the victims of an uncle or the casualties of a war. They are the guardians of a certain kind of truth, that innocence, even when crushed by the weight of the world, leaves an imprint that can never be smoothed over. Conclusion, the bittersweet legacy. Our journey through the shadows of the White Tower ends here, not with a definitive answer, but with a quiet understanding. The story of the princes is a tragedy, yes, but it is also a testament to the endurance of empathy. We care for these boys not because they were royalty, but because they were us, vulnerable, isolated, and longing for a light that was denied them. As the historian puts out the candle and the ink dries on the page, we are left with a final image, 2 small shadows standing at a window that no longer exists, watching a river that never stops flowing. They are the reminders that history is not just a list of dates, but a map of the human heart. And though the tower may hold its secrets, the heart knows that some lights are too bright to be extinguished by any amount of stone. The princes have finally stepped out of the shadow. They have entered the light of memory, where they shall remain, forever young, forever together, and forever free.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.